apart from the fact the Bruno Mars song Count on Me is stuck in my head. And also I just want to explain myself for the viewers that this is not a giant glass of wine.
No, it's gin.
Eamon. It's water. It was the only glass I could find in the kitchen. So it looks bad, but believe me, there's nothing in it. Now, fantastic story. Actually, you've had two fantastic stories in a row in connection with government funds and where they're going and who's collecting them. But this one relates to the father of the alleged gangland figure, Jonathan Gill, and a firm that he has set up that's been paid hundreds and thousands of euro of state funds to house Ukrainian refugees.
Yeah, so we've been able to look at a couple of these companies which have at different points been listed on the quarterly payments by the Department of Integration, which I went through this description with Niall previously. There's a longer version.
Yeah.
At the Department of Children and so on. And there's about 10 different areas they cover. But for the purposes of this story, we just call it the Department of Integration. It's just a bit easier rather than using the very long title for the department itself. But they put up quarterly figures of where the money is going to. So there's dozens of firms getting everything from, 40 grand to up to 1.2 million and so on. And some of them are well known and they're well run companies and, and they're perfectly legit and they've gone through all the steps, and including this company now, which...
Is this grants only for the housing of Ukrainian refugees?
Some of them, in this particular one, it appears to be for Ukrainian refugees. Now, the company we're talking about is Astervale Limited. And anything that we have found on public records is that, that the payments that they've got from the Department of Integration has been in relation to Ukrainian accommodation.
Right.
As opposed to the previous story that we did, that was to do with emergency accommodation.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's kind of...
Because what I was going to ask you was presumably this fund for the Ukrainians only set up kind of in an emergency basis at the beginning of the war, which is 3.5 years now?
Yeah, that, yeah.
So the companies that maybe were coming to the table were newly set up at that time, some of them?
Yeah, this particular one was set up in 2022 and was and up until we can see the public figures, up until April 2024, it got €414,505, which compared to some of the others is relatively modest. Now, there was no real address of what properties were being used, except there was one e-tender that was published and it referred to Astavale Self-Catering Apartments in Wicklow.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure where that is exactly. We just weren't able to find it exactly. Yeah. Now, they made... with the company records office and separate to what we see from the department, the company records show that I made a profit of 246,000 in 2023 and owns a single property as well, 420,000 worth. That's on the books as an asset. And no, that's really about it. There's
the significance of doing this story, of course, is that Jonathan Gill has been named in court as somebody who's involved in organised crime, both drug dealing and tiger kidnapping. He has no major convictions in relation to those, but he was named in court as that. And he's also been the target of the Criminal Assets Bureau. And in actual fact, it is his father's house, John Gill Snr, who is set up this company. It was his house that was partially searched at some point during that cab investigation.
I believe so, yes. And it's the address that's registered in the company's records office as well, where John Gill, so Gill Sr., was registered initially as a director, but also 95% owner. And then that was transferred to another director, a man called Ian Bonney, who we contacted last week to ask him about it.
Yeah.
And I explained why I was ringing him because of the connection there with John Gill to Jonathan Gill. He was very polite, I must say. And he said, look, I'm sorry, I don't have much interest in talking to you about that. Sorry.
Right.
And that was it, hung up the phone. So,
I suppose we should say, Eamon, that neither John Gill Sr. nor Ian Bonney have any involvement at all in organised crime.
Yeah, there was other little bits we could find out about the company. There was a private house in a very rural part of County Meath called Kildalkey, and it would have been very much kind of residential houses, the usual Irish bungalows on a lane kind of thing. And the company wanted to change, they applied for planning permission to change use of the house into a guest house. So there was actually quite a number of, there was something like 40 letters of submissions that were put in, most of them objecting to it. In fact, I didn't find any that weren't objecting to it. And kind of questioned the whole idea of why was a guest house putting in. So, and some of them did express fears that this might be then converted, from a guest house then to use as a place for international protection applicants or for Ukrainian refugees. And as it happened then, the application was later withdrawn for technical reasons, as I said. It wasn't any particular reason why. So, I mean, at some point it could be re-entered in and, and they could apply
again. What can you see from the applications? Surely if you were going to apply for this state funding and, this is a lot of money, taxpayer money, and other companies are, as you said, this is modest compared to some of the other companies that are claiming this funding. You presumably have to provide accommodation, which you'd like to think would be checked, that it is accommodation almost B&B style. Is there meals provided, or does there have to be meals provided for Ukrainian refugees?
Yeah, there would be it's different from contract to contract, because you might have, say, a guest house that's already beside a bigger centre, and so they might say, well, that's just going to be for accommodation, so you don't have to provide meals. They're going to get meals next door, or we're going to have a different place for people to eat. I mean, we've seen that with some of the temporary arrangements, like some of the camp style places that were set up, which are now gone. There was one in Kildare. And there was different ways of doing it. Some of them, also part of the contract might be to provide a minibus service so people can get in and out of town if they're in a rural area. So it can all depend. And no, we don't actually see the contracts. They're not available. We just see the kind of the payments that are made in these cases.
So we're kind of liking to hope that all these checks are and balances are happening.
Well, there is
this money is approved.
Yeah, there is some. I did find some guidelines or somewhere, I think, on one of the department pages, and it's basically the entity that is applying, it has to be a company that is tax. It has all its tax certificates. In other words, so I mean, if somebody has set up a company 2 months before it puts in an application, of course, its tax affairs are going to be in order, because there's nothing to rise yet. So So I mean, and I suppose there's an element of emergency about this. So there was at some point, quite a high number of people coming in, and the government were obliged to house them. So they were looking for people to do it, and there were plenty of people willing to step in. To run these, to run the operation. They would say to somebody who has. Might have a guest house with 20 rooms, and we'll take it over. We'll use it for the 3 or 4 years, and then it's still yours after that, and we've even seen that already, where some houses, some guest houses and hotels have returned back into the tourism market, and they've been fully refurbished, and the owners have done quite well out of it, in one sense leasing it to these companies who seem according to one accountant that was looking at some of the figures, was suggesting that on average there's a kind of about a 10% profit margin on some of the contracts. So some of the bigger companies are doing quite well out of it, and some of them are quite well-known companies, and it's all above board. But we've honed in on just a handful of companies that we've been able to show that there were links to, people that are there's links to criminality. Yeah, I mean, and that was the other story you referred to was secure accommodation. There's a kind of a gentleman from Draada, Beno Brian, who was named in the Criminal Assets Bureau case against the Maguire brothers as being, involved in criminality and being with the faction that were aligned with the Maguires and opposed to the Boylans, who were also recently named as the kind of the leader of the anti-Maguire faction, as they used to be referred. And in that case, it was like 10.2 million had been paid. So it was a far bigger operation.
And had he got... Did he own the accommodation, or had he leased the accommodation?
Well, that's the thing.
Letting then to the state.
It's not necessarily clear from what you're looking when you're looking at stuff on company records, and like for instance, the company we looked at this week, Astervale, does appear to have a property worth 420,000. It's on the books as an asset, so we presume that's
what is being
but it may not be.
Out.
But I mean, 420,000 could be something else.
Yeah.
But it does appear, it would, the records suggest that it is probably.
So for a house, say, for example, if that's the case, the house worth 420,000, they're making what a year out of renting it?
Well, again, in this case, they were making, what does the figure I gave you, about just over $250,000 or just under it, 246,000. But at the same time, there could be other
expenses.
There could be other properties that we don't necessarily know about. Yeah, because for instance, like the property in Meath that they applied for planning permission but didn't get to use, that appeared in a search of Meath County Council records. When you. It's a laborious process, to be honest with you, going through it. And
you're trying to then get down to the land registry to see who owns the property.
Yeah, and there's all that. And sometimes, the original owners keep it and probably have no idea, they're dealing with, they're not necessarily dealing with gangsters. There's people who are involved who are perfectly legitimate business people, builders, developers, whatever. And it's quite possible that, it's just, we're not actually saying anyone has done anything wrong in this case. We're just saying that there's there are directors who have links to criminality.
Yeah, and if there's a Criminal Assets Bureau investigation going on in one part of the arms of the state, and yet there's a contract being given by another, it seems to be a bit of a disconnect, doesn't it?
Yeah, and again, it wouldn't necessarily be an issue for for a Proceeds of Crime Act investigation. Unless, and I'm not saying for a second that it's happened in these companies, but if in a hypothetical sense, if there was a company that got contracts from the department and there was startup money that was used, say for instance to refurbish a leased property, or to buy buses to bring refugees in and out from town or whatever they need to do. And if that money came out of nowhere, companies have to register, if they have a loan from a bank or if they have a director's loan. And if they don't, I imagine that would be obvious for a forensic accountant. Which I'm not.
Is there a figure ever there that was per person to house one person in these accommodations? How much does that generate? No, sorry, I never broke it down. I'm sure there is. But the rule of thumb, as was put to me, was about 10%, and that some companies can do it better than that and others slightly less. And some of them have been, it depends basically how much the directors pay themselves a lot of the time, especially in the smaller versions of it. That's the mathematics of it. But let's get down to, I suppose, the reason we're talking about this and who is Jonathan Gill.
Most recently, we wrote about him again because he featured in a cab case brought against Pascal Kelly, who is one of these veteran gangsters, been around for quite a long time. Is, I suppose, probably one of the most infamous criminals at one point in the country. He's serving an 18-year sentence for a post office robbery in North County, Dublin, Malahide, I think it was, and it was €92,000 robbery. And that was, there was a woman, a daughter, and a Spanish student who were staying with them, were threatened, and the woman gave terrible, the postmistress gave, really harrowing evidence of the ordeal she went through and talked about, she was face down in the car and she said she remembered spitting on the car floor so that there'd be some kind of DNA evidence left for the guards to find in case she was going to be killed. And it was, it was quite it was long fought. He got his 18 years for that. I know it was... in comparison, then, Gill has no serious criminal convictions, and he openly runs a mediation service. And he spoke to Niall one time about it, and that I think there was a quote from the story that he was very efficient at solving disputes, and he was asked then about.
He's also photographed at one point with Martin the Viper Foley, who runs a debt recovery agency.
Debt recovery, yeah. I would Niall asked him that time. He said, what would you say to people who claim you're involved in organised crime? And I'd say, prove it. Now, we did get more, to go back to the Pascal Kelly cab case. Now, it was a 2016 case, but it was the 7-year rule or whatever came up recently. And so they were cab were back in court to finish off the deal to actually pay over the money it was a couple of cars that were taken. And it came through then, the Garda intelligence or the belief evidence that was given, they highlighted Kelly's criminal background and described Gill as a close criminal associate of Kelly. And they linked him to a 1.3 million haul of cocaine that was to this gang that they were considered, as leading figures in. And that was in Dunabate more than 20 years ago. And the way it was put was, it is believed the drugs captured belong to the criminal gang over which Pascal Kelly and Jonathan Gill exert substantial control. So, I mean, that was the black and white evidence that was put into the High Court.
In regards to Beno Brian, what had he to say about that, or what was his reaction to the story you wrote about his work in this area?
Yeah, well, he basically he was when he called. I rang looking for him, and I rang the company secretary that was registered, and he rang back then. And he more or less said, "Look, I'm not a director anymore." And pointed out that he resigned in May, and I kind of was pointing out to him then that but 10.2 million had already been paid up to March that year, so this came after it. And he mentioned, look, he pleaded guilty to a violent disorder charge, and he said he resigned before that he'd made the plea, so he wasn't breaking the law by being a director of a firm with a criminal conviction.
What did he say about his links to the Maguire criminal faction? Maybe we'll just go a little bit over what that Maguires are and who their rivals were.
Yeah, so the Maguires would have been, I suppose, like Brendan and Owen Maguire were seen as the leaders of the Maguire faction, and they were in this, as we know, fairly nasty feud with a faction led by the two Boylan brothers, Keith and Josh. And so there would have been, I suppose, the way we kind of, one of the points of how we got into this particular company was that Beno Brian was registered as a director, and his address was given at Hardman's Gardens, which was an address that stuck in my head because I'd been there knocking on the door in 2019 after a gunman opened fire and shot at 5 people who were outside, and there was one gentleman that was shot in the leg, I think, as well. I think another bullet wound. And
2019 would have been the height of that criminal feud in Draada, which really brought the town to its knees. And I think in recent times, Christy Mangan, the then chief superintendent of the area, described how it was at that point that he was considering bringing in the army, that law and order was about to completely break down in Draada, a very busy, prosperous town, commuter town from Dublin, with its own large population that was being taken over by gangs who were in this very violent tit-for-tat war, which culminated really when Robbie Lawler abducted the young teenager Cian Mulready Woods and murdered him, dismembered him, and dumped his body parts in various locations, a story that hit the headlines not only here, but as far away as Mexico, where these kind of things are even probably more familiar. But it was one of the most violent feuds that we can remember, certainly. Not that any feud where people are being killed isn't violent, but it was the level. There was sort of lines in the sand crossed in Drogheda.
I think it took a lot of people by surprise. I suppose even us to some extent, like Drogheda wouldn't have necessarily be seen as a hotbed of crime, and even in a way now still wouldn't be. It was just, I suppose it was the unlucky battleground, for gangs that I suppose that...
and a couple of crazies that were around at the time. I mean, Lawler was subsequently killed himself in April of 2020.
Yeah, and it was a bit of a regional thing as well. It was more, it wasn't just Drogheda, it was kind of the northeast and North County Dublin. And I
think there was backing coming in as well from those bigger gangs, the bigger mobs in Dublin. There was a lot of younger people were being backed, were being armed, and were being sent out to, do battle. Communities were caught up in it. I mean, from a kind of a sort of a business point of view, there were fears that investors were going to pull out of the town, that it was going to cause unemployment, and other financial hardships like that for what was and should be a very successful town where people should want to and do want to live in peace and harmony without this sort of stuff going on. So that's why we're interested in Beno Brian, because he's there in somewhat in the middle of that, and he's named in the CAB documents.
Yeah, so I mean, there was the 5 people that were there. Like there was a man who was shot was Devon Nadican, and they were in the front garden of Derek Kavanagh, who is he's Beno Brian's father, and also there were 2 of Derek Kavanagh's nephews, Mark Kavanagh and Wayne Kavanagh, and basically the gunman opened fire. As Cap put it, all these persons, referring to the 5 named, are suspected of involvement in criminality and are close associates of the Price Maguire OCG. A gunman fired 5 shots indiscriminately towards this group of men at the front of Derek Kavanagh's home. And they believe that the Boylan OCG were responsible, as the Kavanaghs are closely aligned to the Price Maguire. So,
And that's from an affidavit that's been opened in the High Court.
Yeah, so that really kind of puts you, whether you like it or not, in kind of the centre of things. And, I mean, look, it's...
And when was his company set up, and when was he claiming that money, from what time period?
The 10.2 million was over about, I think it was 2.5 years off the top of my head now, trying to remember.
It's from about 22 again?
Yeah, again, it would have been, it was set up in September 22 and had been paid then. They had there was at least 2 emergency accommodation centres that we were able to identify, one in Louth and one in Cavan, and that they had applied for planning permission to use another building, one of them actually in North Inner City, Dublin, which didn't go ahead. In 2023, made a profit of 447,000. So, they're making decent money, in that sense. And again, it's nothing necessarily wrong with that. They're doing everything by the book. We should make
clear here as well that this isn't a story about Ukrainian refugees or any other international people who are, entitled to home here or a roof over their head. It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with the people who are claiming government money and what their background is. Did the department speak about this or have any comment to make at all?
No, I wasn't really in contact with it's actually the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. That's why I was just referring it to as the Department of Integration. No, we didn't necessarily contact them on this particular one. I mean, we might have we're still working on part 3 of the story,
exactly.
So it might be worth getting onto them this time and say.
And anybody who has any further information of anybody of interest that we should be looking at in regard to all this, do get in touch. All our social media is all open there, and you can talk to us in confidence if you so wish. The fact of the matter is, there's a huge amount of money washing around in all this.
Yeah, there is, and I mean, and it was set up in a hurry because it was an emergency situation, and I suppose a lot of companies plan, for steady growth. They aren't necessarily ready to quickly switch into a whole new sector, and so you've had. All sorts of companies, the vast majority of them legitimate, who've been able to kind of adapt quickly and react quickly and tender and win some of these contracts. And some of them are well organized, very large companies, who are connected to developers and are, all perfectly above board. I mean, even these companies are actually above board. Like, there's nothing untoward, in their
setup.
And
it's their tax filings.
And everything is absolutely legitimate in both companies. It's just that there's a link between between some of the directors to organized gangs.
Crime.
And you have to consider that some of these people coming in are often some of the most vulnerable people, young women with children, people fleeing, very serious conflict abroad. And there's a duty to protect these people. I mean, even if you're going to kick some of them out, you need to protect them in the meantime.
You're doing something in a rush as a country. I mean, this stuff also came on just on the back of COVID, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're talking kind of the middle of 22.
Yeah.
When these 2 companies certainly were set up.
So you had all those COVID years where you had, certain companies were set up around, there was a lot of funding, very little time to check a lot of it out. People looking for some of those employment grants and all the rest of it. And also, what were they called again? You see, we can't even remember. We're so fickle. There was a name for all of that when you were...
it was kind of employment support.
Stuff, yeah. And there was also various, companies being set up for those COVID vaccine centres and around that and all the rest of it. And it was just a lot done in a hurry without the backup of the staffing, I suppose, within those government departments that were having to approve or having to check everything. So,
and look, and I mean, even if there was a check, where they had, done what, we did in the Sunday World, like in Beno Brian's case, like he made the point when, he contacted us, he came back and, he sent some emails, letters, he points out that he was never charged, accused or implicated in any such matter by CAB or the courts. And also his solicitor would have said that, said in a letter to us, he denies any involvement in the Draada feud or any connection to any organised crime in any way. He said he was never questioned or charged in relation to any organised crime and has no convictions in relation to this. He was unaware of any mention of his name in the context of the CAB proceedings, which wouldn't be unusual in fairness, until he was informed by us. And given his lack of awareness of his name being mentioned in CAB proceedings, we can only assume that any and all of mentioned him were untested, is the way it was.
And what was his business before this?
I don't know, to be honest. Yeah.
He didn't have any other companies set up before this?
Sorry, I just don't know that. And I don't want to speculate in fairness to Beno Brian or anyone else in regard to that.
And he can certainly, if he wants to, give us further details about his background or his previous employment.
Now, there was one of the Sinn Féin TDs, Matt McCarthy, in April, had brought up the issue of scrutiny of how international protection accommodation service contracts are awarded. And one of the things he said, that there was growing reports of companies with no track record being awarded contracts. And he pointed out there was one particular one that there was a bit of, let's say, controversy about. It was in Dundrum and Tipperary, and it was potential 277 beds. And it was reported that the company was set up 3 months previously with one director based in Mallorca. And again, not suggesting that there's anything untoward about this. It's perfectly legal. You know, anyone is allowed to do this. But this is a contract worth potential millions. Yeah,
and you'd imagine, though, that there would be checks made in regard to that. Where were these beds? You know, why was the director who... A company like that, I mean, taking in 277 people, that's like running a full hotel every night of the week.
Yes, it is, yeah. But then again, I mean, it's perfectly legal. There's this, and I mean, and it is, I suppose, it's a problem for the department and for the minister involved that there's proper checks carried out, and that they will suggest there is. And I mean, and as we're making the point, like, I mean, you could have done all that with Beno Brian and still come up with a green light, because as he said, these were all untested and unproven.
Well, look, I think we all know that there's a lot of suspicions around certain people that are involved in, claiming these government grants. A lot of it was done in a rush. I'm talking about stories that we haven't yet published that we're working on in the background. I'm talking about stories that I've been told of certain people who are involved in this, who have made a lot of money and should never have been given some of these contracts. So we'll continue to work on these stories. And anybody, as I say, who's any information or any concerns about it, do get in touch. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.